Hi, welcome to LCAP Workshop Day 1. We're going to start in just 1 minute. All right, it's 3:01. We'll go ahead and get started. This is Bonnie McFarland from our LCAP State and Federal Programs Unit, and I'd like to welcome you to Day 1 of our LCAP training for this year. And we hope you're going to join us for Day 2 on February 15. Today, you're going to be hearing from most of our team members, including Adrian Balcazar, Debbie Cano, Rachel Garcia, and Jeannie Keith. And we're happy to be joined by 3 of our colleagues from Business Advisory Services here at LACO. That's Dio Bracci, Belinda Martinez, and Hoyt Yee. You'll find the link to the slides in the chat, and the recording of the meeting will also be posted on our website within about 24 hours, so you can find all of that there. So before we get started, just a couple reminders. And the first is that this is the year 3 of a 3-year LCAP plan. So this will be the final year, and a new year 3-year plan will be required for beginning in 24-25. So this is the last year of this cycle, and then next year you'll get a new plan. Keep in mind as you're planning that this is the last year. So you want to be true to the plan and what you've committed to, but you also want to make sure you're looking at the effectiveness of your actions and services. So think about the changes that you want to make for the coming year based on the data and the impact that you're seeing for students, but also you might want to keep in mind any long-term systemic changes that you're considering that might require more time to consult with stakeholders and your educational partners, and also just more time for planning and building consensus on those changes. So you're kind of on 2 parallel courses, but for now we're looking at changes for the coming year. And throughout today's presentation, what you're going to see is how the sections of the plan work together to form what we call a through line that's designed to promote continuous improvement in your programs at the district. There have been no changes in the template for this year. However, throughout the presentation, you're going to hear some things some factors that might impact services. So on the previous slide, we have just some information about questions. So can you back up one, please? There we go. So as with most of our meetings, a lot of times your questions are technical or require us to get some more information. So we provide a Q&A. We'll provide a written follow-up from your questions in the chat. So please put those questions in there. They're very helpful and help us see the kinds of things that you need assistance with. So we will get that Q&A out to everyone who participated and everyone on our LCAP listserv. All right, now we'll look at the next slide, which is our topics for today. And you can see that the focus is going to be on the LCAP template and the components of the template. So we're going to look at each of those components and the requirements for them. And in addition, we'll be looking at the local indicators. And on Day 2, we'll go more in depth on some of the more challenging areas in the plan, and more information on Day 2 is going to be provided later in the presentation. The next slide just provides an overview of all the components of the LCAP. And what you'll see that the first is the budget overview for parents, and that's going to be required again this year as always. The LCAP template itself includes 4 sections, which are listed here, and we're going to review all of those today. And then finally, the submission includes multiple action tables, which our Business Advisory Services consultants are going to review for you today, along with a more in-depth look at them on Day 2. You'll note that the one-time mid-year supplement required last year is not a requirement for this year, and therefore it's not a part of this submission. So this lists the components, and these need to be posted in this order and submitted to us with all three of those components included. All right, next slide. These are just a few reminders and sort of good practice. And these are some things that haven't changed from year one of the LCAP. And the fundamental principle underlying the LCAP, that if you adhere to those three sort of fundamental principles of equity, transparency, and accountability, if that's at the forefront when you're developing your LCAP, chances are you're going to meet many of the legal requirements and you're going to meet the intent and purpose of the plan. Next is a reminder that the responses to the prompts in the LCAP template are required to be written in a way that's understandable and accessible to parents. So it needs to be clear and comprehensible. So we suggest not including acronyms and technical language, and making sure it's defined and it's clear and comprehensible. Also, keep in mind that the instructions provide technical information for LEAs to complete the template properly. The instructions have the full force of the law and they supersede the prompts. And we'll talk about that a little more in just a second. Keep in mind that for an LCAP to meet approval criteria, the LEA has to adhere to both the template and the instructions. So they're both critical. And the instructions are part of the template, and therefore they need to be posted when you post your LCAP. So let's look on the next slide a little more about those instructions. So keep in mind that the instructions, as we said, are a critical part of the LCAP. Be sure to follow the instructions in the back of the LCAP template when you're writing your plan. Fortunately, you have to go pull out the instructions, but you should have them right beside you when you're working on the plan. The prompts, we've been informed many times that the prompts in the plan in the LCAP template are written for parents and other educational partners. They don't address all the detail that's required to meet approval criteria. The instructions address all the approval criteria. And when you read them, some of them have a lot there, fairly complex. So many of the problems we find result from districts not addressing the requirements that are embedded in the instructions. So keep in mind, sometimes one sentence in the instructions has multiple criteria embedded in it. All right? Just a reminder on the instructions, the intent of the LCAP, and next we have some resources for you. And this list, these are mostly from the California Department of Education. You have the template, the tables, and the instructions are all available on the CDE website, including the budget overview for parents and the instructions for the budget overview for parents. And we have also a link to a summary of legal requirements from our office. And this lists all the requirements in the plan and can help you as you review your plan before you submit it. And then finally is a link to the CDE webinars that they've been presenting. There are future webinars coming up. So if you haven't been watching them, you can click that link and look at, see the future ones, sign up for those. Right? So that's sort of the 1, 2, 3, the beginning. And now we're going to move in and I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who's going to look at the plan summary. Rachel?
Thank you, Bonnie. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Bonnie mentioned, we'll be taking a look at the first section of the LCAP template, which is the plan summary. Next slide, please. There are 5 components within the plan summary section, which you can see screenshots of on this slide. And so this includes the general information, reflections on successes, reflections on identified need, LCAP highlights, and the comprehensive support and improvement prompts. Now, the purpose of this section is to provide a meaningful context for the LCAP, to provide information about the LEA's community and relevant information about student needs and performance. So in order to provide a meaningful context for the rest of the LCAP, the content of this section should be clear and also in alignment with the content included in the subsequent sections of the LCAP. Next slide, please. So here we see the general information prompt. And so when responding to this prompt, LEAs will need to provide the reader with information about the LEA, such as the students and the community, enrollment and employment information, the number and size of specific schools, and also recent community challenges. When responding to this prompt, LEAs may want to consider what information would enable a reader to more fully understand the LEA's LCAP. Next slide, please. For the next prompt, LEAs are asked to describe the progress that they are most proud of and how they plan to maintain or build upon that success. So this response should be based on a review of available state and local data, which may include progress towards LCAP goals, also feedback from educational partners, and any other relevant information. For this prompt, LEAs may also include specific examples of how past increases or improvement in services for foster youth, English learners, and low-income students have led to improved performance for these students. Next slide, please. The next prompt in this section is the Reflections Identified Need prompt. And for this prompt, LEAs are asked to provide a description of any areas that need significant improvement based on a review of available state and local data, again, including input from educational partners. In addition to identifying the needs, LEAs must also describe the steps that they are planning to take to address the areas of need that they identify in this section. Additionally, LEAs are required to include a specific goal in their LCAP to address one or more consistently low-performing student groups or low-performing schools if they've been selected for the required goals. And so LEAs that are selected for the required goals list must identify in this response that they are required to include a specific goal and must also identify the applicable student groups and/or schools being addressed. So keep in mind that this was something that was new last year, and at the time it only applied to 7 districts in LA County. Now, the new required goals list for the 23-24 LCAP were just released yesterday, and several additional districts have been added to these lists. You can access the 2023-24 required goals list on the CDE website at the link provided on the slide. Next slide, please. So again, for the Reflections Identified Need prompt, you will need to identify areas of need and the steps the LEA is planning to take to address these areas of need. And although the prompt and instructions have not changed, it's important to note that the way in which the instructions apply this year for the 23-24 LCAP is slightly different. So at the top of the slide, we've included the template instructions for this prompt. And if you take a look at these instructions, you can see that they reference colors in the dashboard. However, as you know, the 2022 dashboard does not have colors, but rather status levels that are reflected in the cell phone bars that range from very low to very high. So for the past 2 years, guidance has been for LEAs to base their reflections on the most recent available state and local data. However, CDE recently shared at one of their Tuesday at 2 LCAP webinars that because the 2022 dashboard will have verifiable state and local indicator data, LEAs are required to adhere to the instructions provided for this prompt as follows. And so you can see these instructions highlighted by the red box. So for part A, LEAs will need to identify and address any state indicators for which it received the lowest performance level applicable to that indicator. So for the graduation rate, ELA, math, and English learner progress indicators, the lowest performance level would be a status of very low. And for the suspension rate and chronic absenteeism rate indicators, the lowest performance level would be a status of very high. Additionally, LEAs must identify and address any local indicators for which it received a status of not met. For Part B, LEAs will need to identify and address state indicators where any student group is performing 2 or more performance levels below the all student group. So that means LEAs will need to look at the status for all students for the applicable state indicators, and then identify any student group or groups that are performing 2 or more status levels below the all students group. And the next 2 slides provide examples of how these instructions apply to the 2022 dashboard. So this first example illustrates where you would look in the dashboard to address Part A of the prompt. On the main page of the dashboard for the sample district, we see an overview of the LEA's performance on the state and local indicators. You can see that this LEA received the lowest performance level on chronic absenteeism, which is a status of very high. And they also received the lowest performance level in mathematics, which you can see a status of very low. You can also see that this LEA received a standard not met on 4 of the local indicators. So this sample LEA would need to identify all 6 of these indicators in the response for Part A, as well as the steps it is planning to take to address these areas of need. Next slide, please. So this next example illustrates where you would look in the dashboard to address Part B of this prompt. And here we've included screenshots of 2 different state indicators for this example. So in the first indicator shown on the slide, we see that the all students group received a status level of high for English language arts. When we take a look at the performance level of the student groups for this indicator, we see that English learners, foster youth, homeless, and socioeconomically disadvantaged students received a status of low, which is 2 levels below the all students group. We also see that students with disabilities received a status of very low, which is more than 2 levels below the all students group. So all of these student groups would need to be identified and addressed for this indicator in the response. In the second indicator shown on the slide, we see that the all students group received a status of low for suspension rate. And when we look at how the student groups performed, we see that students with disabilities received a status level of high for suspension rate, which is 2 levels below the all students group. And we also see that foster youth received a status of very high, which is more than 2 levels below the all students group. So for the suspension rate indicator, students with disabilities and foster youth would need to be identified and addressed in this response. LEAs would need to go through this process for each of the state indicators on the dashboard to identify and address next steps for any student groups performing 2 or more levels below all students. Next slide, please. The next prompt in the plan summary section is the LCAP highlights prompt. And so the response to this prompt must include a brief summary of the key features of this year's LCAP. So this is an opportunity for the LEA to capture in a snapshot what's to come in the plan. Essentially, it's a hook to invite the reader to read the rest of the LCAP. And one recommendation for this section is to complete it at the end, after all of the other narrative sections of the LCAP have been completed. Next slide, please. The CSI prompts are the last component within the plan summary section. And this section only applies to LEAs with 1 or more schools identified for comprehensive support and improvement. So it's important to note that the 2022-23 CSI eligibility list has not yet been posted. However, the CDE is anticipating the release of this information within the next week. And so for the first CSI prompt, LEAs will need to provide the names of the schools identified for CSI. The second prompt asks for a description of how the LEA supported the CSI school in developing their CSI plan. And this description needs to address how the LEA has supported or will support the CSI school or schools with conducting a school level needs assessment, identifying evidence-based interventions, and also identifying any resource inequities to be addressed in the plan. The last prompt in this section asks for a description of how the LEA will monitor and evaluate both the implementation and the effectiveness of the CSI plan. And also keep in mind for this section that the responses to these prompts should really focus on what the LEA is doing to support the CSI school, and not necessarily on what the CSI school is doing. It's more about LEA support. And that concludes the plan summary section. I will now turn it over to Debbie for engaging educational partners.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Hi, everybody, good afternoon. So this section is engaging educational partners. In the past, this was formerly referred to as stakeholder engagement. And as most of you may know, the CDE ceased to use the term stakeholder and are now using educational partners as of last year. So this does not apply just to the LCAP. This is a change across all of our educational literature and throughout California. And it just takes a little while for documents to catch up. So if you see stakeholder, it should be changed to educational partners. Just next slide, please. Okay, so as you are working with your educational partners, you should make sure that they have a foundation and the understanding of the California state priorities and the role of the educational partners as one of these priorities. LCFF provides for an increased level of local flexibility to determine which programs and/or services have the greatest likelihood of ensuring that each student will succeed in relation to each of the 8 LCFF priorities. And in exchange for this flexibility, the LCFF model requires greater local responsibility for selecting appropriate and effective programs, which necessitates transparency and engaging educational partners in analysis and decision-making. The goal is to allow educational partners that participate in the LCAP development process, as well as the broader public, an opportunity to understand how the LEA engaged its partners and the impact of that engagement on the plan. Next slide, please. So building trusting relationships and connecting goals, actions, and data to student learning are the cornerstone of the LCAP development process. These foci will result in a plan that is well thought out and will positively impact student learning. The LCAP template is a document, not a process. LEAs must use the template to memorialize the outcome of their LCAP development process, which should reflect comprehensive strategic planning through meaningful engagement with educational partners that meet the legal requirements as reflected in the final adopted LCAP. This section section included with the LCAP template do not and cannot reflect the full development process. And just as the LCAP template itself is not intended as an engagement tool. So the template is used to memorialize a summary of that process. Next slide, please. The process of developing and annually updating the local control accountability plan should support school districts and charter schools in comprehensive strategic planning, accountability, and improvement across the state priorities. and any locally identified priorities through that meaningful engagement with educational partners. In this process, you will be collecting and reviewing data, which are the metrics of the LCAP, state and local indicators, and other local data that you have included. And you're going to consult with educational partners, reviewing that data, asking for input to identify student needs and how do I address such needs. Then you develop and revise the LCAP and report the progress for each of the LEA's local indicators. And then you continue to engage your advisory committees, you review the school plans, and then you consult with your SELPA directors. Part of this engaging educational partners is also a public hearing to solicit recommendation and comments regarding the specific actions and expenditures of the LCAP. Revisions made if necessary, and then finally revisions are made if necessary from the input and comments and final draft to the public meeting for adoption. That's the process in summary. Next slide, please. The required groups for educational partners to be engaged for districts and charters include teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, parents, pupils, the SELPA administrator, and local bargaining units. And of course, that's for districts only. And the required district advisory committees for the purpose of the LCAP are the Parent Advisory Committee, which now this year is new, that this Parent Advisory Committee should or must include parents of students with disabilities. So you need to have a representative on that committee who is a parent of a child with disabilities. And then the other parent advisory group would be your English learner parent advisory group, which your DLAC can serve in this capacity. If you look on the slide, the asterisks are indicate the requirements for charters that are using the LCAP as their SPSA. And this, for the two parent groups, when the superintendent presents the LCAP to these groups for review, and their questions or comments need to be responded to in writing by the superintendent, and that would be these two groups. Next slide, please. So here we are with the template itself. So this is a snapshot of the template. And there are 3 prompts that need responses. We're going to go through each of these prompts and compare the prompt and the instructions. As Bonnie explained earlier, there is a difference between the prompt and the instructions. Next slide, please. So here in prompt 1, we describe the engagement process used by the LEA to involve educational partners in the development of the LCAP. So including at a minimum who you met with. This means the list for you to list all required groups that you've met and consulted with and how you met with them. A sufficient response here to this prompt would include general information about the timeline of the process and the meetings and other engagement strategies that were used to meet with your educational partners. A response may also include information about the LEA's philosophical approach to engaging its educational partners. So again, who did you meet with and how? And you must list each of the required educational partners that we listed earlier. Next slide, please.
My God.
Okay, prompt 2, to describe and summarize the feedback provided by specific educational partners. So here you're going to describe and summarize the feedback provided by the educational partners that a sufficient response would indicate their ideas, trends, and inputs that emerged from an analysis of the feedback received by the partner, but from your partners. You would want to list what was important to different groups. You share the goal analysis prompts with your groups and maybe data that you have your annual data and information and get their feedback. So remember, there are four goal analysis prompts for each goal. So going through those would help you as you prepare to write those responses for those prompts. And in this prompt here, in prompt 2, you want to summarize. You could put a heading and the different, you could say parent advisory group, and then give the information the parents prioritize, teachers unions. So you'd want to just give that information by group. Next slide. So prompt 3 is really informed by prompt 2. You can't have prompt 3 without prompt 2. So a sufficient response to this prompt is going to provide the educational partners and the public with clear information about how the engagement process influenced the development of the LCAP. The response must describe aspects of the LCAP that were influenced by or developed in response to the educational partners' feedback described in prompt 2. And this may include a description of how the LEA prioritized requests of the educational partners within the context of the budgetary resources available or other prioritized areas of the LCAP. So you want to be clear what aspects of the plan were influenced by the feedback from educational partners and which groups. How were the feedback issues prioritized? Meaning, which was the first thing that you were going to spend your money? If you have a limited amount of money and you are not able to do everything, how did you prioritize your list, and what were the attributes of making something more important or higher on that list? And next slide, please. You see this prompt 3 has the longest instructions, and please read through this carefully because the information here in the instructions really should guide your writing. Again, the prompt on the template is for the reader, who is your general public, your educational partners. The instructions are for the writer, who's you, who are going to make sure that you include all of the required details that's being asked for. And next slide, please. The through line. In summary, this section of the plan should detail the process of engaging your educational partners. You really want to see the connection through. So prompt 1, again, who did you engage and how? Prompt 2, summarize the feedback from the different groups. And prompt 3, detail how and where that feedback is reflected in your plan. And now Adrienne is going to share with us information on goals and actions.
Thank you, Debbie. So the next section in the LCAP template is the goals and actions. The LCFF-State priorities are the foundation of your LCAP, and there's no requirement on the number of goals you must have in your LCAP, but your goals, actions, and expenditures should be prioritized within one or more of the state priorities. And in determining how to prioritize these goals within the LCAP, LEA should be using the data on the performance of the state and local indicators, including the locally collected and reported data of your local indicators that are found in the dashboard. A key point to remember is, at minimum, the LCAP must address all LCFF state priorities and the required metrics. Here is a screenshot of what the goals and actions section of the template looks like. It has not changed from last year's template. And so here you will be providing for each goal, the metrics, and the description of the actions. The first part of the goals and actions section is the goal. The purpose of the description of the goal is to state the what. You will number each goal and provide a description of what the LEA plans to accomplish, what the LEA plans to do, and how will you know when you have accomplished this goal. The next part of this section is to provide an explanation of the purpose of the goal. It explains the why. Why did you develop this goal? For example, you might start off stating, we developed this goal based on the analysis of student data, or educational partner feedback, etc. In order to support the prioritization of the goals, the LCAP template provides LEAs with the option of developing 3 different kinds of goals. They are focus, broad, and maintenance of progress goals. It is not required to identify in the goal description which goal you are developing, because the format of the goal pretty much determines the type. However, it may be helpful for your educational partners to know which type of goal it is if you do state it. We do find that it is helpful for readers. So the focus goal is a goal that is more concentrated in scope and may focus on a fewer number of metrics to measure improvement. A focus goal statement will be time-bound and makes very clear how the goal is to be measured. A broad goal, which is more or less what we see most often in LCAPs, is a goal that is less concentrated in its scope and may focus on improving performance across a wide range of metrics. The broad goal is for all students and will address those things that are ongoing or long-term. And the last type is the maintenance of progress goal. This is a goal that includes actions that may be ongoing without significant changes. This allows an LEA to track performance on any metric not addressed in the other goals of the LCAP. For example, an LEA may have all teachers properly credentialed, buildings in good repair, and students all having textbooks. So the current level is adequate and not looking to improve, so the goal is simply to be maintained. As Rachel mentioned earlier, for specifically identified LEAs, they must now include a goal that describes the clear connection between the LEA's performance and the planning process of how they are addressing the needs of either the consistently low-performing student groups that they've been identified for, or addressing the needs of low-performing schools within the district or LEA. The links are provided again here for your convenience. Here is the metric table with more specific information and details. For the 23-24 LCAP, you will be providing the information in Year 2 outcomes column as indicated here. So here we're looking at the outcomes, and you have to identify the expected outcomes. Just note that on day 2 of our training on February 15th, we will go more in depth on the required metrics, and we will provide a tool that will assist you in finding the data reports that you will need to complete the Year 2 outcome column. And so again, you must include here when you're indicating the data for Year 2 outcome, you must include the school year of the data that is being reported, especially because of the baseline and Year 1 outcome may possibly have different dates. And so it's really important that you do include that year as indicated by the instructions, because it will allow your educational partners to know exactly the source and what year you're drawing that information from. Next is the action tables. The actions included in your LCAP are for all students and specific student groups to achieve the state and local priorities. The action description should clearly state who or what and how the action will target a specific need and how it will move the LEA towards its goal. Your actions are designed based on the needs of the identified students in which the action was created for. Keep in mind that the description of any contributing action is designed to increase or improve services for the low-income, foster youth, or English learners in your school or district. These contributing actions are designed to address the specific identified need, condition, or circumstance of these specific students. When designing a contributing action, the scope of the action is often overlooked or often misunderstood. So simply put, the scope of the action is who will be receiving the action or the service. There are 3 choices: limited, LEA-wide, or school-wide. Limited is when the action only serves the foster youth, English learners, and or the low-income students. For example, an EL intervention may only serve the EL students because it is uniquely designed for their specific language needs. With the LEA or the school-wide, the actions here are provided either LEA-wide, the action is providing the action or service to all the schools in the LEA, or if you choose school-wide, the action is providing the action or service to a certain school or schools or a specific grade span or grade spans. But no matter what the scope of the action is, an action being provided on an LEA or school-wide basis must always be designed to address the unique needs of your low-income EL and or foster youth students. And lastly, the action will increase or improve services for unduplicated pupils as compared to the services that the LEA provides to all students. And this is very important to make sure that this is clear to all of your educational partners. Here is another screenshot of the action description table, but this has the instructions in each column embedded within the template. Some key points to note is that there is a requirement to include specific actions for student groups. So if you have a numerically significant number of EL students, which is 30, then you must include actions in your LCAP for English learners that address first, the language acquisition programs provided to the students, and secondly, the professional development activities specific to English learners. For the foster youth, if you have a numerically significant number of foster youth students, which is 15, you are still encouraged to include specific actions in the LCAP designed to meet specific needs to the foster youth students. The last two columns of the table, you will include the total funds for each action, and you will indicate whether the action is contributing to meeting the increased or improved services requirement by using a Y for yes or an N for no. The goal analysis is also part of the goals and actions section. And this is part of the annual update, which reflects the implementation and effectiveness of your actions in your 22-23 LCAP. Here you can see how the actions are tied to the tables of the 23-24 total planned expenditures and your 23-24 contributing actions. Now we're going to the goal analysis. The goal analysis is also, again, part of your goals and actions section. This is part of your annual update, which reflects on the implementation and the effectiveness of the actions in your 22-23 LCAP. The goal analysis has 4 prompts that must be addressed. Here, the instructions are embedded within the prompts because this is a great example of showing how the prompts are for the reader and the instructions are for the writer. There are many components that must be addressed within the prompts. We will go deeper into this in day 2, but wanted to explain how the instructions require specific components compared to the prompt. So if we take a deeper look at prompt 1 asks for you to describe the 4 components: the overall implementation of the actions, the successful aspects in the implementation of actions, the challenging aspects in the implementation, and describe any actions that were substantively implemented differently from the original planned action. So all of these components would fulfill the requirement of the instructions for prompt 1. Prompt 2 is a little more straightforward, and this is asking for the description of any material differences between what you budgeted to spend and what you estimate your actual expenditure will be. So what was the reason for the difference? So again, you're explaining to your educational partners what happened and why. Prompt 3 asks you to explain how effective the actions were in making progress toward the goal. What do your specific metric outcomes show? Is there a direct link in how the actions and metrics demonstrate growth towards meeting the goal? So this can be tricky. You can cluster some of the, you don't have to go action by action and metric by metric, but you do need to look at it in a way that makes a clear connection for your educational partners to show did you get the outcomes that you were intending based on the actions that you implemented. And prompt 4. This last prompt asks for the description of any changes made to the planned goal, metrics, desired outcomes, or actions to this year's LCAP and or the upcoming year's LCAP. So this is your opportunity again to explain what happened or what's going to happen in the upcoming LCAP. There are 3 components to the annual update: the report of year 2 outcomes in your metrics table, the responses to the goal analysis prompt, and the 3 annual update tables which connect the expenditures and address the spending requirements. And they are the 22-23 annual update table, the 22-23 contributing actions annual update table, and the 22-23 LCFF carryover table. And now Jeannie will continue with the increased or improved services section of the LCAP template.
Thank you, Adrienne. Good afternoon, everyone. If you can go to the next slide, please. This section provides information about the increased apportionment an LEA receives to increase or improve services for their foster youth, English learners, and low-income students. It provides 3 descriptions addressing how the LEA plans to use these funds to increase the quality and quantity of services for these intended student groups, as compared to services the LEA is providing for all students. This section provides educational partners with a comprehensive description that connects to the contributing actions in the goals and actions section and to the planned contributing actions table for the 2023-24 school year. First, we're going to take a look at the fiscal summary included at the top of this section. The large box at the top provides fiscal information about the supplemental and concentration apportionment the LEA plans to receive for the 2023-24 school year. And the gold box includes carryover calculated from the current and prior year LCAP. Next slide, please. Per the instructions, LEAs provide their LCFF funding apportionment in the top row and the related percentages. This includes the projected LCFF supplemental and or concentration grants that an LEA receives for the coming school year. This apportionment is based on the number and concentration of the LEA's low-income, foster youth, and English learners. A new component was added last year, and this is the projected additional concentration grant funding that is provided to LEAs with high concentrations that are greater than a 55% enrollment of English learners, low income, and foster youth. Additionally, the projected percentage to increase or improve services is the percentage calculated that reflects the proportional increase in funding an LEA receives as compared to the funding provided for all students. Next slide, please. Additionally, some important items were included last year, and this next set of fiscal information includes these items. Here we see the percentage and dollar amount for carryover that is identified in the carryover tables. If a carryover percentage and or dollar amount is not identified in the carryover table, then the LEA indicates 0% and $0 as carryover. Per the instructions, LEAs calculate the total percentage by which the LEA must increase or improve services for their English learners, low income, and foster youth, as compared to services they are providing for all students in the LCAP year. Here, LEAs add the projected percentage to increase or improve services for the coming year with the proportional carryover percentage to determine their total percentage required to increase or improve services in the coming year. This calculation reflects the proportional increase in funding for the coming school year and the percentage of LCF carryover of funds from the current and prior year LCAP. Next slide, please. Next, we look at the required descriptions that connect to the contributing actions developed in the goals and actions section. For the first prompt, LEAs provide an explanation for how each contributing action that they are providing either LEA-wide or on a school-wide basis is principally directed to and effective for the intended student group. For the second response, LEAs provide a description of how all the contributing actions included in the LCAP are increasing and or improving services by the proportionality percentage required. In the third prompt, LEAs with greater than 55% enrollment of unduplicated pupils will describe how the actions they will provide using the additional concentration grant add-on funds will increase the number of staff who are providing direct services to students at schools with a concentration of greater than 55% foster youth English learners and low-income students. Next slide, please. So this visual is provided as a reminder that each of these descriptions connects to the contributing actions included in the goals and actions section and the additional detail included in the contributing actions table. So next we're going to take a look on the next slide. On the next few slides, we're going to take a look at the details required for each of these descriptions. So first of all, prompt 1. The first prompt connects directly to the actions the LEA has identified as contributing to the increased or improved services requirement that the LEA is providing either to an entire school, school-wide, or across the LEA-wide. So per the instructions, for each school-wide or LEA-wide contributing action, the LEA must explain how it is principally directed and effective in meeting the goals for its unduplicated pupils. These explanations must address 3 components. These are included in the instructions. First, the LEA needs to explain how the action considers the needs, conditions, or circumstances of its unduplicated pupils. Next, how the action is based on these considerations. And third, how the action is intended to help achieve an expected measurable outcome of the goal. Key to this description is that when the contributing actions have been planned with forethought in response to what the LEA has learned about the relevant needs, conditions, and circumstances of one or more of the intended pupil groups, and there is intentionality in how the action responds to these unique needs, and there is a clear outcome that is expected for the intended students, this section will be easy to explain for each action. The instructions also indicate that making conclusory statements that an action will achieve an expected outcome without explaining how the LEA designed the actions to be responsive to the intended student groups to achieve an intended outcome are not sufficient. Likewise, stating that the LEA has a high enrollment of unduplicated students does not provide the required explanation about how the service will be provided. Next slide, please. In cases where there is less than 55% unduplicated pupils, either LEA-wide or less than 40% school-wide, the LEA must include an additional explanation. This explanation must explain the basis upon which the LEA determined that the wide action is the most effective use of the funds for the intended student groups. And these descriptions could include the alternatives the LEA considered, supporting research, their experience, or educational theory. Next slide, please. All right, we'll go on to prompt 2 now. So prompt 2 connects to all of the contributing actions in the action table. This can be LEA-wide, school-wide, and or limited actions. Here, the LEA needs to describe how these actions together are expected to result in the required proportional increase or improvement in services that was calculated for the total percentage to increase or improve services. We saw this total percentage in the fiscal summary. And here, consistent with the requirements of Title V, California Code of Regulations, Section 15496, these are the LCFF spending regulations. LEAs need to describe how services provided for their unduplicated pupils are increased quantitatively or improved qualitatively by at least the percentage calculated, as compared to the services provided for all students in the LCAP year. It is included in the regulations that to improve services means to grow services in quality, and to increase services means to grow services in quantity. Services are increased or improved by the contributing actions, whether they are provided LEA-wide, school-wide, or on a limited basis to one or more of the unduplicated student groups. Next slide, please. Prompt 2 also includes a planned percentage of improved services option. This was new last year. And this is addressing any limited actions contributing to meeting the increased or improved services requirement that is associated with a planned percentage of improved services in the contributing actions table, rather than an expenditure of LCFF funds. If included, these are limited actions that an LEA may include with zero funding. For these actions, the LEA must describe the methodology they used to determine the contribution of the action towards the proportional percentage. This percentage of improved services for an action would need to correspond to the amount of LCFF funding that the LEA estimates it would expend to implement the action if it were funded. And so the LCAP instructions related to prompt 2 provide an example to address how the LEA would calculate this percentage for any limited action it may include that does not include any funds. Next slide, please. Right, the third prompt in the section connects to the concentration grant add-on funding that LEAs with unduplicated percentages of greater than 55% identified in the fiscal summary at the top of the section. So here, LEAs describe how they will use these funds to increase the number of staff who will provide direct services to students at schools with an enrollment of greater than 55%. In the description, LEAs need to identify the goal and action numbers in the LCAP where the action is increasing the number of staff who are providing direct services to students at these schools. A couple of things to consider. First, for LEAs where all schools have an enrollment of greater than 55% unduplicated pupils, LEAs will also need to explain how they are increasing direct services at selected schools and explain the criteria they used to determine which schools require additional staffing support. Additionally, in situations such as in smaller LEAs, where the additional concentration grant add-on funding may not provide enough funding to increase staff for direct services, the LEA needs to describe how it's using these funds to retain staff, providing direct services to students at schools with enrollment of unduplicated pupils that's greater than 55%. And connected with this requirement, if you go on to the next slide, is a ratio table. And this ratio table is included with prompt 3, will be included by LEAs receiving the concentration grant add-on funding that have schools with less than 55% enrollment of unduplicated pupils and schools with an unduplicated pupil enrollment that is greater than 55%. These ratios required are fairly straightforward. Here, LEAs will provide the staff to student ratio of classified staff providing direct services to students at schools with a high concentration of unduplicated pupils, and the staff to student ratio at schools with the lesser enrollment of unduplicated pupils. To calculate this ratio, the LEA may consider grouping the schools either by grade span, such as elementary, middle, and high. The staff to student ratio must be based on the full-time equivalency of staff and the number of students enrolled as of the first Wednesday in October each year. For each of the settings, the LEA will also provide the staff to student ratios for certificated staff in the last row. And with that, that concludes the increased or improved services section. I'm going to turn it over to our colleagues in business advisory services to address the action tables.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Hoyt Yee. I'm one of the business services consultants here in business advisory services. I, along with my colleagues, Gil Brocky and Belinda Martinez, will be giving a brief overview of the action tables. Next slide. The purpose of the action tables are to identify and summarize the current and coming year estimated and planned expenditures by the funding source, personnel, non-personnel costs, goals, and actions. And the action tables also are used as a tool to effectively communicate with educational partners and demonstrates how the LEA is meeting the requirement to increase or improve services for foster youth English learners and low-income students. Next slide, please. The starting point for the action tables will be the data entry table. This will be the foundation. Keep in mind, this applies to just those users who use the LACO's LCAP system or the doc tracking services system. The information that's entered into the data entry table will ripple through and automatically populate the other action tables. Now, keep in mind that there are going to be some manual input on some of the tables, but we'll be going over that in a few minutes. Some of the data that is entered here in the data entry table will be your projected LCFF base grant for 23-24, the projected supplemental and concentration grant for 23-24, the LCFF carryover percentage. We may be going into a deeper dive on day 2 on the carryover percentage calculation. Some of the other data will be your goals, your actions, whether the actions contribute to increase or improve services, total personnel or non-personnel costs, and then the funding sources, federal funds, local funds, LCFF funds. After you've completed filling in all the information on the data entry table, now it's time to move on to the actions table. And I'm going to turn that over to Dio.
Thank you, Hoyt. Good afternoon, everybody. Dio Brocky here. The total planned expenditures table, as Hoyt mentioned, is a derivative of the data entry table. The table summarizes the funding sources by LCFF funds, state, local, and federal funds that will support the planned expenditures in the LCAP year. The chart also segregates the planned expenditures by goal, action, student group, and expense classification. Next chart, please. The contributing actions table is also a derivative of the data entry table. This chart focuses on the funds and activities that are designated as increasing or improving services in the LCAP year. An important component of this chart calculates a district's percentage to increase or improve services, inclusive of any LCFF carryover percent, if applicable. Now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Belinda Martinez-Garcia, who will further discuss the action tables.
Thank you, Dio. So now we're going to shift our focus from tables that are related to the coming year and planned expenditures to tables that relate to the current year and estimated expenditures. So starting with the annual update table, thank you. This table contains information about the estimated actual expenditures for all LCAP actions, meaning both contributing and non-contributing. And it compares it to what was budgeted for those respective actions. So as my colleague Hoyt noted earlier, the information on this table will come from what was entered in the data entry table, but there will be some manual entries required. And we've highlighted the area with the red arrow and that green star on the far right. So for these entries, it is critical that the estimated actual expenditures are as of June 30, 2023, which is the end of this fiscal year. So in other words, these amounts should be the annualized total cost for the 22-23 fiscal year. So I want to take this opportunity just to note that it's going to be imperative that program staff and fiscal staff at the district level work closely together to ensure that these amounts reflect accurate calculations, because more often than not, these calculations will include accrued cost. And we'll go over that in greater detail on day 2 of this LCAP series. Next slide, please. The contributing actions annual update table, as the title highlights, are all things related to contributing actions and the funding generated by our high need student populations. So this table identifies the current year's supplemental and concentration grant amount, what we call S&C, and it provides a comparison of what was planned versus the estimated actual expenditures for those contributing actions. Now, this table is of much importance because it's going to have a direct relationship with the carryover table. Now, as with the annual update table, this table will also require some manual entries. And so your first entry up in that upper left box column is going to require you to enter the district's estimated S&C grant amount. And it should be based on the most current calculation for the 22-23 fiscal year. As many of us already know, the LCAP timeline doesn't always align with fiscal timelines. So funding rates change, enrollment counts change. So again, I can't emphasize enough how critical it is for district program and fiscal staff to work together to ensure that the most updated SNC funding calculation amount is being reported in that section. On the right-hand side, starting green, I also want to highlight that we need to make sure that, again, the estimated expenditures for contributing actions are as of June 30, 2023, because if they're being underreported, it may have a negative impact on the district's LCFF carryover calculation. So with that said, next slide. We have the last table, the LCFF carryover table. This table calculates the unmet portion of the percentage to increase or improve services that the district must carry over in the coming LCAP year. Again, there is a manual entry, but this time it's for the district's estimated LCFF base grant amount, and it should be based, again, on the most current LCFF funding calculation that the district estimates it will receive for the 22-23 fiscal year. This excludes the SNC, the supplemental and concentration, grant entitlement, and other funding add-ons. And if you'll notice, I know it's hard to read, but on the second column, it already separates it for you. You'll have your estimated supplemental and concentration grant amount there, which feeds from your contributing actions annual update table that we just went over previously. One more thing, yes, I want to also highlight that third column with the yellow star, and note that this was 0% last year for all districts, and that is your LCFF carryover percentage. But this may not be the case this year because there are some districts that may have had carryover from the 21-22 school year, and so that percentage would be reflected in that column. Next slide, please. Now we have the budget overview for parents, and we just want to make mention of this document. It's also known as a BOP or the BOP for many districts. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. All right, the budget overview for parents is mandated per Ed Code. And the requirement is that it be developed in conjunction with the LCAP. And so here we have a visual of what that end product or what that document will look like. And it's basically a 3-page summary document that provides budget information and fiscal transparency, not just for parents, but also for families, educational partners, and the community at large. And so, like I said, we just wanted to introduce it because it is a component of your LCAP. It actually serves as a cover page to your LCAP, but we're going to get into much greater detail as to how to complete it on day 2 of this LCAP training series. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our ASM team.
Thank you, Dio. Thank you, Hoyt. Thank you, Belinda. I truly appreciate our partnership, and we are in the final stretch of today's workshop, so hang in there, and I'll be going over the local indicator process. Next slide, please. So LEAs will use the 22 dashboard state and local indicator data to inform the 23-24 LCAP. As this information is applied to the LCAP, please consider the following. This information is very important because it will help tell the story, tell the progress of your students' achieve improvement. In this process, it includes updating and informing your educational partners and community on the progress of established goals, actions, or services. This review and annual update is the key in planning as it leads to additional input or specific feedback that could be highlighted in the LCAP. And in this, progress is then tracked and monitored by multiple measures and metrics. And this includes state and local reporting data that's on the dashboard, along with other important information that is collected through local data. Next slide, please. So what are the local indicators? For local control funding formula, LCFF priorities, where data is not collected at the state level, an LEA will measure or report its progress through the dashboard based on locally collected data. Local indicators provide valuable information necessary for educational partners to engage in meaningful engagement with a holistic understanding of the local success and challenges, and informs the LCAP planning process. And local indicators apply to all county offices of education, school districts, and charter schools.
Next slide, please. Here we see the local indicators that LEAs must measure progress and report on annually based on locally collected data. You see that not all the priorities are represented here on the slide, but all your local indicators are represented here. This includes basic services and conditions, implementation of state academic standards, parent engagements, parent and family engagement, school climate, and access to a broad course of study. The last two local indicators listed here only applies to the county offices of education. And also in the slide is the link to the LCFF state priorities summary. Next slide, please. The State Board of Education approves standards for local indicators that support LEAs in measuring and reporting their progress within the appropriate priority area. For each local indicator, LEAs must annually measure its progress in meeting the requirements of specific LCFF priority and report the results as a part of a non-consent item at a regularly scheduled public meeting of the local governing board at the same meeting in which the LCAP is adopted, and report the results to the public through the dashboard using the State Board adopted self-reflection tool. Next slide, please. So if an LEA satisfies the 3 performance standards noted on the previous slide for a local indicator, the LEA will receive a performance rating of MET in the dashboard for that local indicator. If an LEA does not meet all 3 performance standards for a local indicator, then the LEA will receive a performance rating of not met or not met for 2 or more years as applicable in the dashboard. Next slide, please. So in this section, we will review priority 1, the basic services and conditions, and specifically the teaching assignment portion of this priority. So there are 3 aspects to this priority 1. There's the aspect of teachers being assigned and fully credentialed for students. And the second aspect, students have access to the standards-aligned instructional materials. And the third aspect is that school facilities are maintained in good repair. And for now, there have been no changes made for the instructional materials and the facilities portion of priority 1. However, in June of 2022, the state published the first year of teaching assignment monitoring outcome data, which must now be used to inform the teacher part of priority 1. Notice the stars, a little change. So in addition, on October 20th, 2022, the Local Agency System Support Office, or LASSO, co-hosted a Thursday at 3 office hours with the Teacher Learning and Policy Office on Teaching Assignment Monitoring Outcome, or TAMO, data and the LCAP. The link to the presentation and the TAMO webpage is included in this slide. LEAs are encouraged to become familiar with the TAMO reports on the Teaching Assignment Monitoring Outcomes webpage, because with this, LEAs will have to determine how they address this new data. Next slide, please. So as LEAs prepare for the process of measuring progress for each indicator, here are a few important steps to consider. First, you'll want to make sure that you're familiar with each of your local indicators and the self-reflection tools. Next, it will be important to determine what data needs to be collected and what process you're going to use to collect that data. And once the data has been collected and analyzed, you'll use the findings to report progress through self-reflection tools, as well as to determine the needs of the LEAs in order to inform the development of the LCAP. Next slide, please. An LEA uses the self-reflection tools included within the dashboard to report its progress on the local performance indicators to the educational partners and the public. The collection and the reflection on locally available data will support LEAs in completing their self-reflection tools. Remember, reporting in the dashboard and in the planning and your improvement efforts. The self-reflection tools are available on the CDE website in the Local Performance Indicator Quick Guide. And the Quick Guide was updated in September 2022, and the link to the guide is included in the slide. Thank you, and next slide, please. Again, there are 2 reporting requirements related to the local indicators. First, the results must be reported to the governing board as part of a non-consent item at the same public meeting in which the LCAP is adopted. And second, reporting requirement is to the dashboard using the state board adopted self-reflection tools for each local indicator. Next slide, please. And as you backwards map your LCAP development process, one of the things that will also need to be considered is the local indicators timeline. As mentioned in the previous slide, LES must present the 22-23 local indicators outcomes data to the governing board. Again, which meeting? At the same board meeting in which the LCAP is adopted. So if you have not established a plan on what data will be collected this year for local indicators, you'll want to do this as soon as possible so that you can begin collecting and evaluating the data collected. The 22-23 local indicator data should also inform the development of your 23-24 LCAP. So it will be important for the LEAs to connect the local indicator process with the LEA planning process. And remember that the 22-23 local indicator data that is presented to the governing board in conjunction with the adopted 23-24 LCAP will also need to be submitted in the fall of 23 or the 2023 dashboard. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights the sections of the LCAP where the local indicator data would be included or inform the development process. There are some sections of the LCAP in which the instructions explicitly reference local indicator data. For example, in the plan summary section, the local indicators are explicitly referenced in the instructions for the reflections on successes and identified needs. The goals and action sections also explicitly references local indicators in the instructions. The local indicator data can also inform feedback from educational partners, as well as the identification or needs and progress and effectiveness in both the goals and actions and increased or improved services section. And as my colleagues have presented, you see a lot of this data and you see that through line through everything. So next slide, please. So to support your work with the local indicator process, we wanted to highlight some available CDE resources. The CDE hosted a webinar on January 17th to provide information on the dashboard local indicator process. So we've included the link to CDE's PowerPoint from that webinar. And we've also included a link to the CDE local indicators webpage, which provides information and resources on the local indicators, including the self-reflection tools. And thank you. And this concludes the section on local indicators. So thank you everyone really for participating in the day 1 of the LCAP workshop. Thank you to our Business Advisory Services partnership. And please remember that we have our day 2 coming. So please save the date, Wednesday, February 15th at 3 p.m. We will take a deeper look at the metrics, goal analysis, and increased or improved services section. And in addition, we will discuss budget overview for parents, timeline and approval process, LCAP submission process, and the eLCAP overview. The registration link is also provided for you to share with others that may need to attend. So with that, thank you so much. Please place any last questions that you may have. We'll leave the chat open for a few minutes and we will get the Q&A out to you as soon as possible with responses to your questions. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.